Good morning to you all, at least where I am in the United States. I understand we have colleagues from around the world today, from the Philippines, from China, from Malaysia, and many of you are joining from other parts of the world. We are delighted to have you here to examine the role of Asian civic and community land conservation organizations in achieving national 30 by 30 goals. We will be moderated today by my colleague Shenmin Liu, who is a graduate of Renmin University in China and has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Chicago. She's been with the Lincoln Institute both in our Beijing office and in our Cambridge, Massachusetts office for some 6 years now, and has become an outstanding young expert in community and civic land conservation. So Shenmin, I'm so happy to turn the program over to you.
Thanks so much, Jim, for the introduction and also this opportunity for me to organize this webinar. And thanks so much to the audience across the globe to join us today. My name is Shenmin Liu. I'm a research analyst at Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and regional representative for Asia at ILCN. Today's webinar is ILCN's first webinar on Southeast Asia, actually. As you may know, in December last year, the historic Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was finally adopted at UN Biodiversity Convention COP15. One of the most important goals is the 30 by 30 goal, which is to protect 30% of the land and marine areas by 2030. As an area contains almost 18% of the world's biodiversity hotspots, and with almost 500 million people living in this area, Southeast Asia is threatened by a series of environmental challenges, such as deforestation and illegal wildlife trade. However, conservationists are working very hard to identify best practice that will advance efforts to reach this 30 by 30 goal. We are very lucky to have three brilliant speakers working very hard on land conservation in different areas in Southeast Asia. They are Yunzhu Chen at Global Environmental Institute from China, Giovanni Reyes at Philippine SDCA Consortium, and Melissa Payne at the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership from Malaysia. Without further ado, let me introduce them and let's hear from their experience and cases. Our first speaker is Yunzhu Chen. She is Senior Program Officer of Ecosystem Conservation and Community Development Program at GEI based in China. With a background in conservation science, stewardship, and biodiversity, she is currently leading the East and Southeast Community Conservation Network program. She'll give us an overview of civic and community land conservation in Southeast Asia, along with some best practice from across this region. You can type your questions in the Q&A box anytime. We have 30 minutes in the end to address all questions. Yunzhu, please take over from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shimi, and thank you, Jim, and to give me this chance to introduce my work and introduce ourselves. So I'm going to share my screen. And can you see it clearly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Very clear.
Thanks. So today I'm going to talk about community-based conservation collaboration in East and Southeast Asia. And just to give a very brief introduction of who we are an organization called Global Environmental Institute. We actually conduct research, develop tools, and provide support for the sustainable development of China and nearby countries. So we're established in 2004 in China and in Beijing, and we are a Chinese non-government, non-profit environmental NGO that work alongside key policymakers, businesses, scientists, and different stakeholders to foster dialogues and to try to have innovative solutions to protect environment and to promote the sustainable developments. So there's just a very brief map of where we work. We are Chinese NGO, but we do a lot of work overseas. So we worked in China, in Myanmar, in Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. We also do have works in some countries in Africa. So we're trying to work with more countries. It's to do a lot of collaboration works. So today's topic, I'm going to focus on the biodiversity in East and Southeast Asia. Just to give a brief background, Shenmi also mentioned that the biodiversity and ecosystem are very critical in Southeast Asia. Actually, in the East and Southeast Asia, there's at least 6 of the world's 36 biodiversity hotspots, which contains an exceptional concentration of species, and they are very endangered as well. And the unique and critical ecosystems in this area possesses the rich biodiversity and are also threatened by a lot of things, such as deforestation, rapid loss of biodiversity and habitats, as well as illegal wildlife trade, and many more actually. So, but due to the geographic networks, ecological corridors, and densely populated indigenous people and local communities, these environmental issues can only be addressed through collaborations across countries and among all stakeholders. So why we need the participation of indigenous people and local communities? Because we believe that the IPLC custodianship is consistent with the conservation of biodiversity. Actually, 43.5 million square kilometers, which is around 32% of the global landscapes, are under the protection of these people, and 91% of IPLC lands are considered to be a good or fair ecological condition, and at least 36 of the KBAs also lie within their lands, which means that to actually achieve the 30 by 30 goal in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, we need IPLC's participation, and their contribution is actually really crucial for us to achieve that goal. And based on that, I think that's how we developed this method called community-based conservation. Just to engage the IPLC in the biodiversity conservation, a lot of local NGOs and international NGOs develop this effective approach. Actually, CBC has very diverse forms in different countries. For example, in Cambodia, they have these policies that allow the local people to establish community protected areas themselves, to give legal rights for the local people to protect their lands. And in Myanmar, they are try to promote this community forestry, just to give local people a 30-year of rights to use the forest sustainably. And some other countries, such as China, we have co-management to try to engage local people. And we also have social forestry in Indonesia. And the Philippines, we have ICCAs. So there's a lot of different forms under this approach. And today, there are over 10 international NGOs, such as Conservation International, and WCS, WWF. They all worked in Southeast Asia to conduct biodiversity conservation based on IPLC. And not to mention the countless number of local CSOs and NGOs that work in this region to engage local people for the biodiversity conservation. So for GEI, ourselves started from China, of course. Since 2004, we had CBC programs in a lot of provinces in China. Actually, these projects help to protect over 150,000 hectares of lands and benefit over 60,000 of people. Basically, the major area we're working is in the western part of China, where a lot of minority groups are living in. But based on this, after we have 10 years of work in China, we think it's time to communicate with other countries. And so we start to work with Myanmar government and local NGOs to conduct this CBC works in 27 communities in 4 provinces, which helped them to protect and enhance the management of over 40,000 acres of land there. And based on all these experiences and based on our successful collaboration with Myanmar, we think that the communication and the collaboration between countries is really important, because by working with Myanmar NGOs and governments, we exchange our ideas of how to engage local people, and we also share our experiences and found that it's very useful for both sides. So in 2021, 11 environmental NGOs from 8 countries initiated the East and Southeast Asia Community Conservation Network. And this network is looking to protect multiple ecosystems and critically endangered species with the help of IPLC. So under this network, we have capacity building, we have communication, and we have project collaborations. And these are the approaches we're going to use to achieve our goal. So we now had around a couple of projects in different countries that is working on sites. So currently we have 12 communities that are working with us, and we have those projects in China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And this little map over here shows a couple of our projects. So, for example, in Myanmar, we are more focusing on the mangrove conservation, and we also in Indonesia, we work with them to protect the mangroves. In the Laos and the border sites of China, we are actually working with the communities to combat the illegal wildlife trade. And we also have projects in Indonesia that is focusing on to explore how the biodiversity conservation can integrate it with the renewable energy promotion to get people to have both benefits. So there are focused on a couple of topics, and those are a brief list of members we're having right now on networks. I won't go on more detailed information, but right now we have around 19 members, I think. So I want to show a couple of our pilot projects just to give an idea of the detailed things we're doing with local communities. And the first I want to share is the projects we work with Yagasu Foundation, which is an Indonesian NGOs to give the women's empower on mangrove conservation. And because Indonesia has a lot of mangrove forest, and it has about 23% of all mangrove ecosystem globally. So it's a really critical and important ecosystem for Indonesia. However, they also decline in a very significant rate. That's why we work with the Yagasu Foundation to conserve the mangrove with local communities. So we do 2 things with them. The first, of course, is to conserve. Local communities received working contracts on the planting and nurturing of mangroves, which means that they can benefit from the action of protect. And they also established the community patrol unit to conduct routine patrol of a bigger area of the mangrove forest near their home. And the second thing we do is to conduct the women's capacity buildings. So these workshops are organized specifically for local women and to help them to learn to process mangrove fruits to become an alternative food source. And Indigenous women also were invited to attend Bantic workshops just to use the organic materials from the mangrove. So with the help of these two actions, we help to rehabilitate 1,000 hectares of mangrove forest, and also the local people's incomes has increased to $283 in average, and we engaged women in 5 villages to give them trainings. So basically, this is a very classic community-based conservation program looks like. We had one site for conservations, and also we have a part of that's to connect with the sustainable development, because we want to give incentives for local people to protect. So these are all connected, and we're trying to find a balance between the protection and the development. And the next pilot project I want to show is kind of a bit special because it's just more of a crossing things, because it crosses both the development, the conservation, and the renewable energy. So it tries to give triple benefits to one local communities. So this also works in Indonesia, and because Indonesia has great potential for solar power, and however, many communities in Indonesia, especially these who are in the hotspots, are still unable to access to electricity. So to address the lack of reliable renewable energy measures in the rural communities, and to pursue climate equity for IPLC, we work with local NGO. It's kind of long here, but the short name for them is PRCF. And so we designed a special project in West Kalimantan, Indonesia. So this project is a bit complicated for the models. Actually, it's called it's a mechanism that wants to just to give local villages, households, solar systems, but local people have to purchase the solar system, but not in the cash way. They will give in 2 ways. One is the in-kind conservation, which means that they will do conservation works, such as patrolling or monitoring, and to pay back. So it means that they will provide ecosystem services to pay back a part of the solar system. Another part, they have to pay back in cash. But to help local people to generate that cash, we will establish social enterprises locally to help them generate those cash and pay back. So it become a circle thing that we want use this to both encourage local people to participate in conservation actions, and meanwhile we provide them with resources to start those social enterprises, the business, for them to increase incomes. And the third benefit is, of course, the solar system they were going to use. So they will start to experience and use the renewable energy. So this is a special project we designed to combine a lot of elements, but it starts, it's a really successful one, I want to say. And we think it might be also a good model that we could promote in a bigger area. So that's why I want to introduce it here. So those are pilots we do based on these networks. We do have others, but it's all basically the same, is that we want to try to find the balance between conservation and development, and it's all with the participation of IPLC. So in the next step, in the future, we want our network to keep growing. We want to increase our members to 50 or more, and we want to increase to more countries such as Malaysia and South Korea and Japan. And we want also establish different working groups and to have more on-site projects. And these groups can focus on different topics, such as someone focus on mangrove conservation or the renewable energy integration projects I mentioned. So we want to have more topics under these networks. And also we want to increase our recognition and financial support for CBC, of course. And more importantly is that through this network and through collaboration and communication, we want more governments or different stakeholders to recognize the importance of IPLC and to empower and entitle IPLC to have rights to protect their lands. And because they are important player and they are critical to achieve the 30 by 30 goal for sure. And if you're interested in our network, you can always contact me. My email address is here, and we're going to build our website soon. So there will be more information there to show. And thanks so much for giving me this chance to share. And also I leave my email address here. And if you're interested, you're more than welcome to contact me. And also if you have any questions, please do ask after this session. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Yunzhu, for the overview and introduction of the network, as well as great works GEI is doing in Southeast Asia. Network is very important, just like ourselves, IOCN, like we're trying to bring different stakeholders across the globe and ask them to communicate with each other. And we're trying to amplify their works, and maybe we can transfer knowledge into different territories. And next, let me introduce the next speaker, Giovanni Reyes. As president of the Philippine ICCA Consortium, he brought in as members a total of 16 indigenous peoples communities of all ethnographic types to form this consortium. With a mix of background in urban and regional planning and ethnicity, he advocates for rights-based approach as most effective for biodiversity conservation. Also, from my previous conversations with him, I got to know that initially the language of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF Target 3, mentioned only protected areas and OECMs without anything about indigenous people and their territories. And he worked very hard for this inclusion through engagements with other like-minded groups until in the end, luckily, this is included in the final and adopted target. He'll share the case of indigenous peoples, community-conserved territories, and areas in Philippines. So let's welcome him to hear the story from Philippines.
Thank you very much, Shenmin. Well, very kind of you. This is about a culture-based biodiversity conservation that was demonstrated by our 16 partner communities in the Philippines. And this is an experience that we have done in the last 10 years. So that this pushed the ICCA led conservation, pushed the Philippines at the forefront of inclusive conservation, at least for the Asia region. But there is still a need to better recognize the long-standing biodiversity conservation and sustainable use by indigenous peoples, by scaling it up past the global biodiversity framework, by escalating community awareness, and getting more community members to articulate the reality on the ground, because they are the ones who are on the ground. And we've done this through bridging the gaps between indigenous knowledge and science by means of mapping, as you can see here on the right side. And to put it another way, mapping is basically a translation of the indigenous people's understanding of their territories, their interpretation of the landscapes, and the values that they attach on these landscapes. These are translated into its physical dimension in the form of a 3D model, like what you see here in the map. For indigenous peoples, maps do not arise from 3 to 5 years of survey practice, but rather mapping to them is a product shaped by hundreds of years of time immemorial ownership and stewardship of the nature around them. So the reason why mapping is done by indigenous peoples as a means of protecting the natural environment is because it contributes immensely in cultural survival, because it relates to the sustainable use of biodiversity. The kinship between indigenous peoples with nature has resulted in unparalleled 75% of the country's key biodiversity areas. Of course, globally, Chen mentioned a while ago that 91%, what was it, 91% of the landscapes in the planet are mostly located in indigenous people's territories. And secondly, the reason why we put into maps the knowledge of indigenous peoples is because that indigenous knowledge, besides being distinct, is irreplaceable, in the sense that as applied here, elders, women, and youth start by recalling and writing names of mountains, rivers, sacred areas, old villages in their own language, and by themselves identifying the lines, the points, the polygons. So it's an empowerment process also, in the sense that because the power of mind of a human being at the individual level develops progressively in learning stages, including capacity to memorize, the capacity to memorize places in relation to community events or the landmarks in the map. The sense of sequences of landmarks or understanding routes are learning stages in this process of mapping. And knowledge about locations allow detouring, shortcutting, and creative navigation or survey knowledge. So that is the knowledge being explained by the man in G-string. And he says here that the learning stages of landmarks, routes, survey knowledge are translated into its physical dimension in the form of a 3D model. And so that in just a few seconds, when that is constructed already through participatory mapping, the location of areas are determined already. The location of boundaries, the location of sacred sites, hunting grounds, and watershed are easily located so that they see in the map what they used to memorize in the mind. So and so when it comes to land use planning, these community elders would identify these locations and how these locations relate to each other. So the details of information and all the other parts of the areas are color-coded by them according to the traditional view of the landscape. They themselves provide the coloring. So, for example, what should be colored green? Is it the hunting grounds, or is it the heritage sites, or is it the settlement areas? They themselves will determine the color code of the maps that they themselves constructed. So there you have a map that they can examine, so that they can examine the past and present land uses, and by determining these uses, it will strengthen the community position against inappropriate land uses. So next slide, please. So together with mapping, because of their knowledge of the species of the plants and animals around them, we then determine the state of health of the forest by means of inventory of resources, so that in one side of the mountain we establish a 1 kilometer transect line, so that for every 250 meters there are plots that are established. So in one block, for example, a 10 meter by 10 meter plot, all the plants with height above 5 feet and above are recorded according to the traditional names that the community members themselves know. In a 3 meter by 3 meter plot, all plants that are estimated with height between 1 feet and 5 feet are also recorded. And in a 1 meter by 1 meter, all plants with height less than 1 foot are recorded, so that in all of these plots, all kinds of plants are determined, and the notable descriptions, field conditions, and plant health are noted according to the perspective of the local community. So, so there you have two. You have mapping on one hand, and then you have resource inventory on the other, which determines the state of health of forest, and the other one is the translation of indigenous knowledge into its physical dimension in the form of a map. So, so we have. We can proceed to the next next slide. So we did this kind of mapping, documentation, and participatory planning with our partner communities, and the latest involved at least 10 sites, which you see in the map. All of these sites are indigenous, and when we identified and documented the indigenous community conserved areas, a total of 156,000 hectares were identified and mapped. And following the resource inventory, the scientific method of inventory, we had the plant species subjected to a scientific determination of its carbon content by our colleagues in Washington, by the World Resource Institute, and they found out that 158,000 hectares of ICCAs is capable of holding 10.5 million tons of carbon, or equivalent to the gas emissions of 7 million cars annually. So that's the contribution of a small segment of our population, and we are talking here of 16 million hectares of traditional territory of indigenous peoples. And this one is just a very tiny segment. This is only 156,000 hectares of ancestral territories that we map that are considered of biological significance. So you see the result of merging science and indigenous knowledge can be part of one's advocacy. Next. So you have seen the so then we have basis to participate in international debates, international discussions. For example, in the last COP15 in Montreal, I think many of you were there, and because of our experience on the ground, we are able to call the Conference of Parties to adopt the recognition of indigenous peoples' techniques of conservation, given also the fact that 80% of the planet's biodiversity coincide or are located within indigenous peoples' territories. So during the COP15, I made a statement. There was a live interview, and I called on the international community to adopt indigenous people's rights to recognize their ownership over their territories, because that's the only effective means by which we can prevent a crisis that will befall us. This one, the case of ICCAs in the Philippines was explained during COP15 by calling parties to adopt the indigenous peoples' territories, especially in target number 3, which is exactly about 30 by 30. Yeah. Yes. Next. And so I was fortunate enough that the Global Environmental Institute, based in China, invited me as a co-panelist with the executive director of the CBD and the deputy executive director of the CBD himself. And this was our chance to state directly the position of indigenous peoples and the strength that they bear, given that the spiritual and cultural values are attached to these lands that they themselves have protected for many, many, many hundreds of years. And these are the reasons we have few forests and rivers left, because of these values attached on these lands. You also would understand the fact why protected area systems of government have lower biodiversity level when compared to areas managed under traditional governance systems by indigenous communities. So this was a platform. This was a platform by the GEI during the COP15, where I shared what I am sharing now, and the response was there were so many text messages and emails which says that maybe the other way we can really escalate the model that pushed the country to the forefront of inclusive conservation is for a community exchange learning between countries, and from country to country, escalate that from region to region, so that the Asia region can participate in a learning exchange with the Pacific. Maybe the EACCN can host that. We can of course later on suggest. So we go to the next. And given the role of given the role that indigenous communities have provided to contribute in biodiversity conservation, there was one achievement at the COP15 when a high-level working group on innovative mechanisms was established, including the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, among 17 other high financial moguls, and they included me as the only indigenous person in the world to participate in that meeting. I got dragged into something that I'm not really an expert on, but because this is on financing. But we did suggest that the channeling of funds from bilateral by means of bilateral collaboration must first ascertain that recipient governments respect indigenous people's rights, and this should be proven by policy and legislative processes in order to fund the country. And of course, number two was to get them to understand that there can be direct support to indigenous peoples, but that requires that you ensure consultations and that the representative institutions to a certain support is aligned with the self-determined priorities of indigenous communities. And the third that I presented during this meeting was that support to indigenous peoples may be also done through intermediaries, but the intermediaries must establish that they have a history of good relations with indigenous communities. And of course, these intermediaries should ascertain that they are upholding indigenous people's rights to consultation, participation, and consent in terms of planning and design. Next. So before the draft target 3 of the CBD post-2020 framework, it never mentioned indigenous peoples or their territories. The fact that 80% of the planet's biodiversity is located in indigenous peoples' territories, it was surprising that the language of the draft only mentions protected areas and a very new concept called other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECM. Yet, if you compare the period, protected area systems is less than 40 years, and the OECM concept is less than 12 years, compared to indigenous community conserved mechanism, which runs from 250 to 350 years. So when we advocated for the adoption of indigenous peoples and their territories, it was, I think it was in December 19, 2 o'clock in the morning that it was adopted. And there is this additional language that says recognition and respect for the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including their traditional territories, as part of Target 3. So therefore, we were able to win a portion of that framework through Target 3, which now bears the language of indigenous peoples. Next. So in conclusion, it is cost effective when you work with indigenous peoples. In fact, the target can be exceeded. When we implemented the project in the Philippines, it was a large-scale project with a medium budget, with a medium-scale budget, but the targets were exceeded from 100,000 hectares to 168,000 hectares because the participation of indigenous peoples became open due to the trust that was built in the implementation of the project. So that's one lesson learned. And to scale up the contributions, it's a matter of just supporting indigenous peoples self-determined development, respect for the governance systems, cultures, and the spiritual and cultural values that they attach on these lands. And that explains why we have 80% biodiversity in the planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giovanni, for the fascinating presentation. And I totally agree with you that NGO and scientists should work with indigenous groups and local communities on conservation, and their voice and experience must be heard. And you also mentioned the OECMs, and that's a great, let me just turn to our last speaker. Actually, Melissa will give a presentation on her research on OECMs in Malaysia and share case studies across the country. Melissa Payne, she is the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership and has over 11 years experience in environmental consultancy and planning, natural resource and conservation management, as well as stakeholder engagement. She was involved in a DEF small grants project to explore the OECM approach in Malaysia and the presentation of several key conservation policies and plans. So Melissa, take it over.
Thank you very much, Shenmin. Good morning to everyone here, and good evening. I guess some of you are on the other part of the world here in Asia or Southeast Asia. Firstly, I would like to extend my appreciation to Shenmin, as well as Robin and Jim for inviting me to present at this webinar today. So far we've heard about community conserved areas in terms of ICCAs and ILPCs areas in China, in Myanmar, and Philippines. And I just, as what Shinmin mentioned, I'll be going mostly into exploring OECMs, what it actually means, I guess, and also how we actually try to test out some of the criterias and existing guidelines, international guidelines, as well as the methodology available at international level, IUCN, and how it actually could be applied here in Malaysia. I won't touch so much on ICCAs, but we did actually explore a few community sites here under the OECM concept, which I'll share later on as well. But I'm very fascinated. I don't have much experience working with local communities per se, but I can really relate to Giovanni's presentation earlier, that a lot of the conserved areas or set-asides of social forests and things like that has been happening for a long time, and it's very similar to what is happening here in Malaysia, specifically where I live in Sabah. Next, please. So I guess, as we know, a lot of us know that many areas outside of our national and regional protected areas networks also contribute to effective conservation of biodiversity. And it is important that we should recognize and support such areas because it's very important nowadays in the context of biodiversity loss and climate change. So it's very timely that we start exploring, besides protected areas or totally protected areas, what other concepts or approaches that could be assessed or analyzed a bit more in detail or further, actually. So just coming into putting in the context of OECMs or community conserved areas here. So we know at international level, previously the CBD Strategic Plan for Biodiversity from 2011 to 2020, especially in IG Target 11, there is a mention of OECM. So that was the first time we actually heard that concept, not really concept, but that term of OECM, which came out more than 10 years ago. And nobody knew actually what it meant, what other effective area-based conservation measures, what does it mean, what this area means actually. So I think since then, some countries has taken the approach to actually explore it further. Malaysia just kind of explored it just recently in the past couple of years, what actually OECM means, because I think everyone now is rushing to actually meet our targets, and now, especially with post-2030 global biodiversity targets in 2030, which we know that the targets has now increased compared to IG Target 11. So we have our international commitments. In Malaysia as well, we have our national commitments, and OECMs are featured in our national policy on biological diversity. And it came out in 2016, actually. So you can tell the difference from 2011 and then 2016, that's when OECM was firstly mentioned in our national policy here. But it was mentioned specifically in the Target 6. They adopted what was translated in Aichi Target 11. But since 2016 until 2020, 2021, nobody actually in Malaysia actually explored what OECM means. What was the definition? How can we actually explore it? How can we actually adopt it? How can we actually test it out here in Malaysia? So yes, as part of our project research here in Malaysia, where we conducted part of my organization was actually to explore what OECMs would mean, what OECMs would look like here in Malaysia. And we applied the IUCN international guidelines on OECMs, the methodology, and the site level assessment tool, and how we can actually test it out here in Malaysia. Next, please. I won't go so much into detail of this, but it was just a kind of a recap. This has happened in the past decade. So specifically under Aichi Target 11, it says here by 2020. So this is actually 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. That's when the first term of OECMs actually came out of. So it says here by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas are protected in terms of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So this is the first time that this concept, this term actually came up. And looking into, next please, Target 3, you can see in the previous slide, it says 17% of terrestrial area, 10% of marine area. So this was when the 30 by 30 came up about. So now it has increased by at least 3% for terrestrial and almost 10% for marine areas. So in Target 3, conserve at least 30% of land, fresh water, sea areas. And it mentions protected areas and OECMs here. But it's interesting that Giovanni has mentioned about ICCA somehow, because I haven't seen that online adopted. So I'm really rooting for that, because I think ICCAs, as what you said in your presentation, Giovanni, it's been around for many, 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 many years. But I'm quite surprised it hasn't been mentioned in any of the targets under Aichi Target or the draft action target. So I'm very pleased to see that. Next, please. So in our national policy here in Malaysia, the Aichi target was actually translated into target, specifically under Target 6, and it says here by 2025, that's just a couple of years to go from here actually, at least 20% of terrestrial areas and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved through a representative system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So this was actually featured in our national policy. So since 2016, nobody has actually explored what OECMs would mean for Malaysia. Nobody has tested out what OECMs would look like here in Malaysia. Next, please. So just to kind of let you all know, through the process in the past few years, the ministry who is leading the national policy, who has endorsed the national policy in biological diversity, has commissioned a review, as you know, because now at international levels, there's post-biological biodiversity targets. So we have to realign what our national commitments and targets would look like. So we're very happy as part of our research here as well. We were engaged by the consultant and also the ministry in terms of they wanted to understand what was our process, what was our analysis on OECMs. So we're very happy that they have taken up some of our recommendations and some of our lessons learned and experiences, and hopefully it will be adopted in the new revised national policy. And just to kind of highlight that, we're quite pleased that our national policy, hopefully this new one, which would be hopefully coming out later on this year, would actually feature ICCAs as well as a specific target under the national policy. So we're very pleased to see that finally getting through. Next, please. So I just wanted to share a little bit about my research or the project that we have been worked on, me and my colleagues here in Malaysia, the Malaysian OECM project. So under this project, we actually initiated a process to investigate and explore OECMs, and just to develop an understanding of how this approach could actually operate here in the country. And our kind of overall aim of this research project is to see how OECMs could be part of the protected area network, and how we can strengthen area-based in situ conservation of biodiversity through OECMs alongside protected areas and totally protected areas here in Malaysia. Next, please. And just to give a context of how we actually try to explore OECMs here in the country, we set our main activities around three focal components or three focal areas. Firstly, we wanted to investigate and identify potential OECMs in Malaysia. So how we did this was we invited stakeholders to submit case studies of potential OECM sites, and then we shortlisted those sites before taking them forward specifically into site assessments, going through site visits, discussions, and going through the criteria of OECMs and assessing the site against those criteria. And part of this research project as well, we included a legal and policy assessment of the challenges of implementing OECMs in the country, as well as developing recommendations, especially on the legal policy and institutional reforms needed to recognize OECMs in Malaysia. And another key component of the project or research is actually to create awareness on OECMs, because it was a new term. So we had to engage with a lot more stakeholders to start telling people that, hey, OECMs has been featured since 2011, and now, well, obviously quite recently, the discussion on OECMs in December 2022. We needed to get that concept of OECMs and that term out there, so people understand that we're not now only focusing on protected areas, but this concept of OECMs is now there, and it's our time to explore what it means for Malaysia. And maybe it would be the time for us to actually start looking into potential areas or sites that have been doing a lot of conservation on biodiversity, conservation on plants or animals, and actually give them the chance to actually recognize their efforts. This could be actually maybe potentially be done through the concept of OECMs. Next, please. So just diving a little bit deeper into how we actually started looking into OECMs as part of this research or this project here in Malaysia. And how do we actually evaluate whether those sites would actually meet the OECM criteria? So through this project or this research in Malaysia, we developed a site assessment procedure or a process which firstly involved a site selection process. So this is when we invited case studies, potential case studies across Malaysia, and this followed by a permissions process or an ethic process, or for sites, the governance and the management system to actually give us consent to follow through the next procedure, which is the site level evaluations. It's just going through assessments on specific on the site. So conducting site assessments, conducting interviews with their managers, going through their documentations, going through their management plans to see whether or not the sites would actually meet the OECM criteria. And how we did this is the guidance, we adapted this from the IUCN guidelines and the site assessment tool, which is available on the IUCN OECM site. So all these available guidelines and tools are actually there for us to actually test out, and we can adapt and adopt any of those systems. But since Malaysia hasn't really explored OECMs, we use the IUCN guidelines and site assessment methodology as our main basis of how do we actually start looking to OECMs and potential OECM sites here in Malaysia. Next, please. So before we actually follow through the process of assessing sites, of shortlisting these case studies, we knew that we couldn't do it alone as an organization. We're a scientific research organization, and our focus is mostly on rainforests, on biodiversity. So we needed to have a network of people to actually help us, assist, to guide us, and to advise us which sites would be potential in terms of meeting the criteria, where should we go next. So we knew we couldn't do this alone. So the project, or our research, is supported by an advisory group, and it consists of about 20 members with expertise in biodiversity, in Indigenous people and local communities, conservation policies, governance and management in the areas of marine and terrestrial. And especially here in Malaysia, we've got the peninsula side. So we've got the West Malaysia and we've got the East Malaysia and different states. So we had different expertise from all the different states here in Malaysia, and also generally had an interest in exploring OECMs for Malaysia. And this group of people actually provided independent advice. So we sat together with them and they gave us independent advice on how do we actually conduct the site assessment process, and generally all on the all other focal areas of the project. How do we actually shortlist, and which sites that we could explore further? How do we engage with other stakeholders? How would you want us to actually start disseminating this information? So we thought that this advisory group was really key to the project, because not only we had other stakeholders from organizations of the private sector, but we had a key person who sits in the ministry, who is overseeing protected areas and also OECMs here in Malaysia. And also we had a member from the IUCN task force co-chair, Harry Jonas, who sat on the advisory group as well. So we had quite a diverse member of committee here who guided us throughout the process. Next, please. So how we actually started exploring OECM, the potential of OECM sites here in Malaysia. So at the beginning of the project actually started at the end of 2019. And although COVID hit and it actually greatly impacted the progress of the project, we managed to actually get quite a good number of case studies actually in the beginning. So at the beginning, we conducted consultations in Kuala Lumpur, representing the peninsula, the sort of western side of Malaysia. We conducted consultation meetings and workshops in Sarawak, in Sabah as well, just to introduce the concept, introduce about what this research is about, and we invited the stakeholders, the participants, to submit case studies of potential OECM. So we set a set of questions based on the OECM criteria, and people started filling in possible sites that would actually meet those criteria. So altogether, we actually received about 42 case studies, which is quite a big amount actually at that stage, especially considering that OECM was very new and people were a bit uncertain about what this would mean, whether or not these sites would actually fit into the criteria. And together with the advisory group, we actually shortlisted this up down to 22 sites. These 22 sites, we broke it down. So it's about 6 government. So in terms of its governance system, so 6 sites were government governed, 5 privately governed, 6 community governed and managed, and 4 had a shared kind of governance system, mostly a government and a community governance system here. So together with the advisory group, we sat down and we deliberated in terms of those case studies, and we shortlisted it down to 22 sites. We thought that these had potentials, but we needed to take the step further in terms of contacting these sites and these managers of these sites to see whether or not they would be interested to explore their sites further in terms of assessments on the ground and going through documentations, reviewing of in terms of their management plans, community protocols, for example, if they did any biodiversity surveys. So yes, it was quite a long process, and obviously COVID really did hit us, impacted the project progress quite significantly. But I think that there is a lot more potential for us to work on OECMs in the months to come as well. So next, please. So yes, here are just some photos that we did. We held some consultation meetings and workshops together with different stakeholders, private sector, NGOs, government, non-government. So we actually engaged with quite a lot of people. It was about almost 300 participants here in Malaysia, so in West Malaysia and East Malaysia, just to introduce the concept and invited them to submit potential case studies. Next, please. So we actually hosted the call for case studies on our website in 2019 and up to actually here up to March 2020. And we set a submission form, a case study form here where people could download the form. We gave them guidelines in terms of the criteria of the sites potentially meeting the OECMs. So we hosted this on our SERP website at that time. Next, please. And from the 22 shortlisted sites, we went through a permissions process or a consent process. Because we know that some of the sites involve community conserved areas, so it's important for us to go through the proper process. So I think we kind of standardize this along all the other sites, even though they're privately governed or government governed. So we went through the same process for all these sites. So we did a social entry, we contacted the sites and the site managers, and we conducted, at this stage, it was COVID, so we conducted a lot of online engagement, online briefing. But we found it very difficult when we wanted to engage with communities at that stage because of, I guess, where this part of the world where internet connection isn't really stable, and there are a lot of communities that still don't have access to 24 hours of electricity, that still don't have access to stable internet connection. So we found that quite difficult at that stage, but we tried to work as best as we could by engaging with contacts that we had on the ground, which is a very kind of I guess it's very common here, maybe everywhere parts of in the world, but in Southeast Asia, WhatsApp is a big thing. So we have a lot of group WhatsApps, and that's how we communicated with a lot of communities on the ground at that stage and try to get information from them. So after we did the social briefing, social entry by conducting further briefing and meetings with them, we formally invited them to participate, whether or not they would be interested to go further into the site assessments of OECMs. So we sent them a formal invitation letter, and we gave them formal kind of guidelines on what is expected of them, what type of documentation would be needed from them, and would they be happy to share those documentations later on to the public. So they had to go through this consent process, and once they agreed, they had to sign a consent form to show that they formalized their permission in terms of sharing their information later on to us and also to the public. So from the 22 sites, actually, as you can see here, when we further explored and interviewed some of the site managers, we realized that two of the case studies were unsuitable based on further investigation. They did not fully meet the criteria. 3 sites, when we engaged, they said, no, we would like to withdraw. It's not a good timing at the moment. It's COVID, our priorities have changed. So priorities in terms of conservation of biodiversity is not there at the moment. It was more of trying to kind of sustain livelihood, trying to maintain in terms of health. So they withdraw at that stage. And also 7 sites actually, upon further more of engagement and trying to pursue their interests, in the end, they said, it's not the right time as well for us, but please come back later on. So most of these sites, 7 sites, are actually ICCA sites or community-conserved sites or forests or areas that are managed by communities. But I said here because we think that there are still potentials to further explore in terms of the OECM concept. So I just want to highlight here, not all ICCAs would actually meet the OECM criteria, but there are potentials in terms of ICCAs. If they were interested to go into the OECM kind of recognition, there are I'm pretty sure at this stage, there's quite a number of NGOs who are working with communities and indigenous people here that are actually helping them and supporting them in terms of developing community protocols, management plans for them to better manage their areas. So I think if they move towards that direction, and if communities give permission and are interested to actually start setting those type of documentation somehow or evidences, they might have potentials to actually meet the OECM criteria in the future.
Sorry, Melissa, we may have another like 3 or 4 minutes left, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. Thanks so much.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So yes, so in the end, we actually, out of 22, only 10 sites gave consent, and we explored these 10 sites in terms and we assessed whether or not these sites would actually meet the OECM criteria. Robin, maybe I could skip in and share some of the case studies. I think that's more kind of important. I'd be happy to share my presentation slides to whoever is interested to see how we tackled or tested out the OECM approach here. Next, please. That would be on OECM case studies. Yes, so I just want to share some 3 case studies here. Out of the 3, 2 actually met all the criteria and have potentials to be recognized as OECMs. One is a community site, a marine community site, which has very good potentials to be recognized as an OECM. It's just that they need to kind of start putting together in terms of documentation and working a bit more in terms of their community protocol. So here I just want to share 3 case studies very quickly. One is the Sungai Pin Conservation Area. This is in Kinabatangan. It's a very hot spot here in Sabah, very famous. There's a lot of protected areas, forest reserves, wildlife corridors here. And in this Sungai Pin Conservation Area belongs to a privately governed and privately managed area under Sawit Kinabalu. It's actually an oil palm plantation, but they've set aside 2,632 hectares of their area specifically solely for, and they call it the conservation area, for the biodiversity of very important key plants and animal species there. So I just wanted to highlight one of the key criteria of the OECMs is you have to show that, you know, you are conserving important biodiversity values. So just in this area, in this 2,000 hectares, there is quite a number of rare, threatened, and endangered species under the IUCN Red List species, and also legally protected under state laws. So these are iconic species that you might not find, obviously, outside of Sabah or outside of Sarawak, specifically the Bornean orangutan, the Bornean gibbon. So these are important biodiversity wildlife that can be found here, and they do have robust protection and enforcement and monitoring, and the local forestry department here in Sabah fully supports this, and they actually entered into a memorandum of understanding, and they actually have a 10-year management plan. So actually when we tested this out against the criteria for this site, they actually met all the 8 criteria of the OECMs. Next, please. This is another conservation area, which is also within an oil palm plantation area. It belongs to Wilmar International. Maybe some of you have heard of this name, this company. And specifically here in Sabah as well, they've set aside 2,400 hectares within their plantation area. And here they've done biodiversity surveys, and they have identified IUCN Red List species as well here, and these are also protected under state laws. So a lot of these areas, although within oil palm plantation, actually provide a lot very good important biodiversity values that should be highlighted. And a lot of these plantations, these companies, they have robust protection and enforcement procedures in place, and they go towards RSPO certification, which is this international certification on oil palm, which requires regular high conservation monitoring, high conservation value monitoring and reporting, and they have to establish management and action plans that needs to be submitted to the RSPO on a yearly basis. So they've got quite a robust procedure in place. So for this site, actually meet all the OECM criteria as well. So just one case that I wanted to share about. The next slide, please. Oh no, I think I took it out, but this is, sorry. It was a case study on an island here in Sabah as well, which is managed by the communities there, the local communities, and they've done a lot of monitoring in terms of their corals. So in their area, they've actually, together with an institution here, a local university, when they did a recent survey in 2022, they've identified 13 coral species that has never been found here in Sabah. And out of the 13 species, about 5 to 6 are actually near threatened or threatened, and it's listed under the IUCN Red List species. So I think that area has potentials. They've been doing a lot of monitoring and enforcement for the past 20 years by the communities itself. It's just that they couldn't really fully meet the OECM criteria at this stage because they don't have proper, or as in terms of physical documentation of what their plans of what their strategies are. So that is what is in a way at this stage missing at the moment for some of the community sites to actually meet the OECM criteria. But a lot of NGOs here are working together with some of these ICCA sites or these community sites in terms of developing community protocols to actually strengthen and to actually document some of their strategies and action plans that they've been actually conducting for the past 10, 20 years. I think my time is,
so much. Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for this very thorough presentation. And I'm sure more countries will explore the use of OECMs in achieving a 30 by 30 goal. And Malaysia will be a great example to look into. And now let's turn to the Q&A session. You can type your questions set in the Q&A box or just raise your hand. Let's first turn to Jim. I know he has some questions. Jim, please.
Well, I just want to start by saying what an excellent group of presentations and how interesting this has been today. I think we could go on for 6 hours with just these 3 cases. And so I have enjoyed this immensely, and I think you all are establishing really important new precedents. I have 2 quick questions. Giovanni, how do you do the mapping that you were talking about? I think that's actually a very intricate process to do what we in North America called two-wide seeing. That is, looking at it with the lens of Western science and looking at a lens from traditional science or traditional knowledge. Do you send people who speak indigenous languages and are trained in this kind of mapping technique to go out into the countryside and talk to the people with that kind of knowledge? Or how do you pull that off?
Oh, yeah, well, first we have to be acceptable first to them. And if they have the desire to share with their with other indigenous communities their landscapes, then we facilitate the process. First, of course, you have to have an organization that involves the membership of partner communities who are indigenous peoples themselves. So if the program is to conserve certain areas in the community, like burial grounds, watersheds, things that have cultural and spiritual values, economic and political, like boundaries, they are willing to point this out, but the problem there is that scientifically the method would be lacking. So technical expertise would have to be drawn and to be interacted with the communities. But first, there has to be an agreement if they agree or if they have the consent to map their own territory. They have to understand first what the implications are about mapping before. So in the last 15 years, there were more than 1 million ancestral territories that were mapped in the way that I was showing, and because that is with the information, participation, and consent of communities to first understand what the uses of mapping is. And they start by drawing. We start by just standing on the ground. We give them the stick, and then they will draw the territory. with an elder, the woman, a youth, and children, especially children, because they can describe the place, considering that there are grounds where they play, and they can describe easily what the nature around them is. And the elder can draw. Let's say that the playground is here, the settlement is here, the hunting ground is here, and they started it very simply, and then later on we can put it on paper, and then from paper it will be drawn in a bigger sheet, using just simple methods of identifying the sites that they consider are part of their traditional territory. So when it develops into a training, then that's when we purchase the materials, following their agreement, and then of course people who speak their language are the people that we tap to communicate with them.
So thank you. I'm sure it's a complicated process, and I think it's going to be a global practice someday soon. So thank you for setting that precedent. And Melissa, my question for you is, over the next 5 years, how many OECMs would you like to see established in your territories?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, we would like to see a lot more. At the moment, we've only managed to test out in 10 sites. And out of the 10 sites, only 5 of those sites actually meets all the OECM criteria. But we did highlight that the other 5 sites, for example, that did not meet the criteria has big potentials to meet those. But we want to see in terms of the size. I mean, if we wanted to achieve targets more, we're a bit saddened just through this research or this project, most of the sites identified are quite small. So the one I've presented actually the largest sites that we've actually tested out. And we know there's a lot more in terms of, for example, ICCAs or community-conserved areas that has big potentials. So I want to see plenty. And I'm actually rooting for where I live in Sabah. There's going to be a lot more potential OECMs and ICCAs from here.
Well, again, congratulations. I think you're setting really important precedents. So Shenmin, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. We have one question from the audience. Yihao, he's fascinated by Giovanni's presentation, highlights the importance of capturing local knowledge. In many instances, IPLCs are severely underrepresented, so in national and regional political systems. So he's wondering, like, what advice you have to bring IPLC stakeholders to the table in both democracies and non-democracies. Like, what's your advice to make their voice heard, like how to communicate with those global, international and regional political stakeholders?
Well, it is important that the communities themselves will determine the state of their rights. If you ask them, how is the land tenure system as you face it? Are there land claimants in your territories? Are there other land uses that are counter to the biodiversity conservation measures that we are doing? Are there other land uses that are detrimental to the to conservation? They themselves will know, because they will answer it from the perspective of their interaction with the landscape where they belong. The problem is that if they don't have the language of the of policymakers, they don't have the language of the mainstream. That is where we can come in. That is where I am myself an indigenous, and I know how it feels to be unable to express my sentiments in a group where the experts are high level and where they are very articulate in development, that are far from our approach. So organizing education and policy studies would be the breaking point to inform communities what are certain policies that have an effect on their lands, for example. So if the coastal marine areas, for example, if they consider coastal areas and marine areas or coastal areas as ancestral waters, because the coastal areas or the where is this, the that delicate stones, delicate rocks under the water, if corals, some
corals.
communities consider these corals as their altars or the sacred sites.
Right.
So the water forms part of the ancestral waters, and so they defend it. They do not allow any entry without permission from the community, and that's the reason why it has been preserved. That's the reason why so many fish thrive in the area, because of that religious affiliation that they have on the corals. Not that it is because it is a marine area, not that it is because it's a protected area, but because of the spiritual and cultural values that are attached on the corals. That is why they call it ancestral waters. Now you convert that into a marine protected area, which is a government managed area, or which is a corporate area a management that has absolutely nothing to do with cultural and spiritual values. What will happen? So if you ask the communities that the land is useless without the sea, that means that they have ownership rights over these coastal areas. And if there are intrusions, and if there are other claims to these areas, they themselves will tell you the state of their rights over their territories, whether it is land and sea. So these are the kind of discussions and deliberations and interactions that should take place in these communities where conservation areas matters most, so that they can express it in dealing with the outside world.
Yeah, very well said. And I have another question for Yunzhu. Do you find there is a tension between community and conservation in your region? And how have you addressed that or seen it addressed? I know, like in this area, the tension between development and conservation can be very extreme.
Thanks so much, Shiming, because the tensions, maybe in the beginning when we first to start this projects in some of the communities, but as I mentioned a lot in my presentation, our method we're gonna use is trying to find a balance between conservation and development. So our project's not just only to conserve and to protect everything, but we want to work with communities for them to benefit from the conservation actions, and also to help them to develop so that they have these incentives to protect and just be a part of it. So during our projects and through these methods, we find that the local communities start to more recognize or to accept the concept that they can really benefit from the conservation and not just be taken away from not the rights or that the access to natural resource was taken away from them. So this is what we believed in, is that there's a balance point that we can find between conservation and development, and we always want to involve IPLC and want to benefit them first, and just to help them to develop more sustainably. So that's how we address these problems, and it looks successful for all our projects actually. So I think this is also a good experience.
Great. Although we have another question in the chat box, but we are reaching our 30 minutes. So Jenna, I'll definitely direct speakers to answer your question directly about the funding for IPLCs in achieving 30 by 30 goal. And thanks so much for listening, and thanks to wonderful speakers today. And we also recorded this session. We'll upload it online and share with you later. Thank you so much for joining us.